This is the Tending the Soul podcast. I'm your host, Maggie Hollenbeck. I'm a psychotherapist, writer, teacher, and an avid student of happiness. I'm just thrilled that we're here together. This podcast is all about mental health, how to heal it, protect it, and enjoy it. I'm excited to share what I've learned in my 20 plus years working in the field. If you want to take a more active role in cultivating stubborn gladness in your life and tending to yourself when the world hits you hard, this is the place for you. Let's dive in. Welcome back to the podcast. I do want to quickly acknowledge that the name of the podcast is changing. Not going to be Stubborn Gladness going forward, but Tending the Soul. And that is solely based on professional advice that I just keep the title consistent with my Substack publication, which is called Tending the Soul. Going forward, that's going to be the name of the podcast, but I'm going to talk about all the same stuff that I've been talking about up till now. All things mental health, how to heal it, how to protect it, how to enjoy it, the elements of stubborn gladness, which I think is a very particular type of pursuit of happiness that I am really enamored with. And of course, words that do not have direct translations into English, one of my little word nerd obsessions. But anyway, let's dive into today's episode, which is about what the happiest countries on earth do differently, and how the things that they do impact the happiness of their people. I have been obsessed basically with the Nordic countries over the last year or so, doing a lot of reading about cultural patterns in those countries. And the reason why is because the Nordic countries, all 5 of them, consistently rank in the top 10, and actually they crowd the top 5 of the happiest countries in the world year after year. I believe this last year Norway placed 7th. The other 4 Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland, all placed in the top 5, and that is the norm. And I have been really wanting to understand, what is it that makes these countries so happy? What makes their people so consistently happy? I'm going to talk about 4 different patterns that I have seen across the reading, the listening that I've done over the last year, that I think point to some ways that no matter where you are in the world, no matter where you're listening, that we can start to think about what kind of culture do we want to participate in creating that would raise our levels of happiness wherever you are, not just for you personally, but also for the collective. Also, I think it's important to look at the cultural piece because very often we have, I think in America especially, there's a lot of focus on what you as an individual can do to make yourself happier, to make yourself healthier, to make yourself wealthier. What is the individual contribution to that? And I think that we don't really think about how embedded that is in our culture. America has a very strong culture of rugged individualism. We have a very individual outlook, and that plays all across our culture in terms of political things, in terms of social things, and also in terms of, you'll see all over social media all the time, right? There are books and there are courses and all sorts of ways that you can learn about how you as an individual can do better in your life. And I think that's super valuable because where we do have individual power, then we have individual responsibility to take up that power and do what we can for ourselves. But I also think it's important to notice the ways that an individualistic culture maybe makes choices that do not produce the happiest people. And so I'm going to get into that a little bit. There is a little bit of political discourse in here. Not all of it is that, but there is a little bit because it's an important part of our lives. So these 4 patterns that I see are security, flat hierarchy, which I'll get into a little bit more, a strong connection to nature, and a strong value on community and collective thinking and collective responsibility. So let me go into the security piece first. This is the piece that is social, cultural, and political. So I don't think it's any surprise to most of you that the Nordic countries practice political structures that highly value collective security. Whereas in America, we value keeping more of our income for ourselves so that we can choose and make our own security. The Nordic countries place a very high value on the government providing security for everybody, which actually equalizes the security that's available. And what I'm talking about in particular is knowing that your basic needs are generally going to be met all the way across the board from birth to death. And so what that means is that the government highly values and invests in the birth and the early childhood experience with usually a year of paid family leave for both parents. There is a heavy investment into childcare so that parents who work and can contribute to the society and also know that their children are in quality childcare. Education is heavily invested in. An educated population is a more productive population. This is the way that they see it. Healthcare is seen as a basic human right. It's not something that you have to earn. It's not something that you have to pay into. You have the right to have your basic healthcare needs met. And that is not to say that if you want plastic surgery, that's not necessarily covered unless it is something that is a healthcare concern. But basic healthcare and a robust sense of basic healthcare is a human right and is heavily invested in by the government. And not just invested in by the government, but invested in by the people who trust the government to use those funds responsibly to make sure that the society is cared for. And so what that translates to is higher taxes. And I looked it up just yesterday, actually. The tax rate in the Nordic countries averages, and hold on to your hats, because from an American standpoint, it is surprisingly high. Their tax rates range from 46.2% all the way up to 57% of income. And 46.2, I think, is Iceland, 57 is Sweden, and then the other countries come in the middle there. And most of us, I think, would consider that a high tax rate. And here in America, we talk a lot about taxes and wanting them to be lower. A lot of people wanting them to be lower. And another thing that I found that I think is really interesting is that by and large, the citizens of Nordic countries have absolutely no problem with their tax rates. There is a very high level of satisfaction with those higher tax rates because of what you get in terms of paying those taxes. And just consider what it would be like to pay that, but then to know that all of those needs are met all the way across the board from birth to death, that your basic health care and child care and educational needs are taken care of. What that does is it creates a culture of mutual respect and a high level of trust, which are actually parts of this pattern that also have a high correlation to the happiness levels in those countries. People expect to be treated with respect by their government, and they trust that their government is treating them with respect and will treat them with respect. And that trickles down into the culture. When you are treated from the very beginning as a valued member of your society, you grow up inside of the water, right? I talk sometimes about the water we swim in, and the water you're swimming in is water that says that you're valued and that you're valuable. And what happens then is there tends to be a higher level of self-respect and self-worth in those Nordic countries. Also, of course, not across the board. There are people who struggle, but by and large, that happens. And that bleeds into issues like income equality. Income inequality is starting to grow in those countries. I'm really curious to dig into more of why that's happening more recently. But for the most part, they have had a very equal distribution of income across the society, which also lends itself to generally a happier culture. Which leads me into the second pattern that I've seen, which is something that the Nordic countries call flat hierarchy. I think this is so fascinating. A flat hierarchy basically means that the bottom rung of the ladder of society and the top rung are actually pretty close together. So the ladder is not steep the way we're seeing more and more in America, where I think I just read yesterday that the top 60 something percent of the money in our country is controlled by 0.5% of the population. And then the rest, the other 40%, 35% is controlled by the rest of us. So that's a pretty steep ladder of hierarchy, financially speaking, right? But that does bleed into other things. Whereas in the Nordic countries, it's a flatter hierarchy. And one of the ways that shows up is in companies where the CEO generally has an income level that is 2 to 3 times higher than its lowest paid worker. 2 to 3 times higher. Whereas in America, that often looks more like 35 times higher in some of our corporations. In a lot of our corporations, there's a steep hierarchy. And what that creates is a sense of like, where am I in the hierarchy? And what do I have to do to get above somebody else? And that breeds competition, which can be healthy competition, but can also turn into unhealthy competition and a sense of shoring up my self-worth by getting on top of somebody else. Whereas in a flat hierarchy, there is less need to prove your worth because you're already valued. You're valued at much the same level as anybody else that you are working for, even your boss and even your boss's boss. So that lends itself to, again, a sense of being valued no matter where you are. The flat hierarchy also shows up in education, where teachers are seen as pretty equal to their students. And not that they don't hold more knowledge, but that their perspective or their opinion holds the same value as their students. And students' insights are valued just as highly as the teachers. And teachers are often called by their first name. They don't have that hierarchical Mr. or Mrs. They're called by their first name, and there is this equality there. Another place that I've read that it shows up is in places in like restaurants where the servers, there's not a culture of having to scrape for tips or having to grovel for tips, or grovel is a strong word, but I used to work in the service industry. I'm an actor, and therefore I have been a waiter. And there is often a sense of having to put up with disrespectful behavior because maybe I'm not going to get my tip or I'm not going to get paid for my work appropriately if I speak up for myself. I'll put it that way. And that actually doesn't happen very much in the Nordic countries. So when we go over there and visit, we might feel that the service staff is maybe a little more cold or a little more dismissive than what we're used to. But actually, it just is the servers living inside of a culture where they are valued. And that's just the plain truth of it. There is a cultural concept in the Nordic countries called janteloven. It's almost like a folklore concept in those countries. It comes from a novel that was written by a Danish-Norwegian author in the 1930s, and the novel took place in a fictional town called Jante. And in that town, the people followed a specific set of rules, and everybody followed these rules. There were 10 of them, and I'm just going to name them out. This is Jante's law. Rule 1, you are not to think you are anything special. 2, you are not to think you are as good as us. 3, you are not to think you are smarter than us. 4, you're not to convince yourself that you are better than us. 5, you're not to think you know more than us. 6, you're not to think you are more important than us. 7, you're not to think you are good at anything. 8, you're not to laugh at us. 9, you're not to think anyone cares about you. 10, you're not to think you can teach us anything. I think this is so fascinating because reading that with the American lens, really, that I have, being an American, being someone who lives in a steep hierarchical culture, I am quite disturbed by these laws when I read them. It sounds like those above stamping down those below. But when I think about these laws inside of the lens of a flat hierarchy, it becomes such a fascinating concept to me because the CEO is following the same laws as the mailroom person. The politician is following the same laws as the housekeeper. When I think about what it would be like to live in a culture where everybody followed Janteloven or something like it, when I think about someone like the president following these same laws, or when I think about the CEO of, let's talk about like Amazon or Tesla, right? Or Meta. When I think about those people living by this same credo as their lowest paid workers, right? The lowest people on the rung, I can completely understand why that flat hierarchy exists and why there is a sort of a humble self-respect that everybody seems to have just embedded in themselves in the Nordic countries. And that's an interesting concept all by itself, isn't it? Humble self-respect. I matter, I have value, and I don't have to be a big shot in order to prove that. I don't have to prove it, actually. And by being humble, I am actually expressing that I deeply know to be true, that I have a place here. I find that really fascinating. And the fact that in the Nordic countries, there is a very high level of mutual respect for all different kinds of people, for all different walks of life. They are not having the same fights that we're having over here to simply be respected. Over here in America, of course, that's getting pretty dark with a lot of not only people of color, that's been going on for a very long time. All of it's been going on for a long time, actually. But people of color, women, queer people, immigrants, all having to really fight for the right to be respected and valued. That doesn't happen over in the Nordic countries. There's a very high level of respect for whoever you are and whoever you want to be, which of course leads to a happier people overall. So these two pieces are sociopolitical in nature, right? Because where there is a culture of respect and where there is a high value placed on every person's basic personhood, and the people are investing into that, using their individual tax dollars to fund a collective wellness, that leads to greater amounts of happiness. And I think over here, I think about the fights that we have over taxes, for instance. It's just one aspect. And I really can appreciate that given the water we swim in as Americans, that yes, we want every penny we can keep because we are paying for so much of our own basic personhood and wellness. Whereas I personally feel like if I was paying 50% of my income into a government where my health care was met, my education was met, where childcare was taken care of, I think that I would be happier with that security than I would be with the money. Just something that I think about quite a bit. Now, these other two pieces, these other two patterns have to do with how people spend their time and what they value. So The third pattern I see is a very high value on being close to nature and living a lot of your life very in sync with nature and in connection with nature. And they have a high value on spending time outside, on being in nature no matter the weather. That also, I think, creates a certain fortitude, a certain familiarity with discomfort and learning how to be with that. They have an adage in these Nordic countries where it can get very cold in the wintertime and dark, right? But they say there's no bad weather, only bad clothing, which speaks to their high value placed on being outdoors and spending time in nature no matter what the season. Being outside has all sorts of physiological and psychological benefits. The sunlight, the fresh air, the greenery, the sense of right-sizedness that we can get when we participate in the broader sense of nature. Borrowing a term from the Japanese, Shinrin-yoku, which translates to forest bathing, it's gotten a lot of press in the last 5-10 years as a practice that is very good for mental health. And I think that the Nordic people really understand that and make time for that and make sure that by and large, the people have access to natural spaces, even if they're in a city. I heard recently that there was a town in Sweden that tasked somebody with figuring out which parks to get rid of so that they could develop more housing. And in the process, this guy, I can't remember his name, but in the process of doing this study to figure out, he actually started to develop a very clear correlation between how close people lived to the parks and their levels of happiness and their levels of health. And so actually his job turned into how to maximize people's access to the parks in order to maximize their mental health and happiness. There's a lot of seasonal celebrations and a real embedded understanding of the cyclical nature of the seasons in the Nordic countries. If you have a very dark winter and a very light summer, then just in general, you are going to be more aware of the seasons than maybe someone who's in a more temperate climate where there's maybe a few hours difference, but not 22 hours of sunlight versus 22 hours of darkness in the winter. But that connection with nature is a big part of what people credit with their happiness levels. There's a very strong practice of open water swimming every season of the year. And most of the cities on the shore of the Baltic Sea will actually cut out spaces, public spaces, cut through the ice so that people have a place to swim in the open water every day of the year, even in winter. And there are public saunas and public changing rooms right there that the city provides for its people so that people can touch base with nature every day of the year. There are actually physiological benefits to being in that very cold water, which I may talk about in a future episode. The connection to nature is really strong. And then the fourth pattern that I see is a very high value on community and connecting with others and really savoring moments together. There is a very collective nature to the culture. You see it in terms of wanting to contribute individual taxes for a collectivist good, right? For the highest good of all in the country. But the high value of community also shows up in a lot of different ways in terms of a movement called co-housing, which was started in Denmark, but is the idea of creating a small community where people share a lot of the sort of domestic chores of life, where there are meals that are open to everybody and everybody takes turns making a meal maybe once a month that everybody can come and join in and sit together, Or if you want to be in your own house, you can also be in your own house, but this communal meal is available. There's usually a shed with garden tools and household tools, and one shed that everybody shares, because 20 people don't all need 20 lawnmowers necessarily. That is a resource that can be shared among people. And so there's a high value on, again, creating that space where everybody's needs can be met by the collective. And it also, I think, takes place in just smaller ways as well. There is, in Sweden, there's a practice that's really core in the culture called fika, which basically means like a coffee and a cookie. But a fika is actually like a break from the productive work of the day, where people gather and spend time together talking about just something other than work. And so there are fika breaks all throughout the workday at the workplace, just a little bit of savoring this moment of downtime. And actually the studies show that honoring those periods of downtime actually makes people more productive overall during the day. And hygge, which is a concept that has become very popular all throughout the world, definitely here in America. Hygge is a Danish concept that it's a word that doesn't have a direct translation. I love that. And the best way that we can translate it is something along the lines of coziness and togetherness and comfort. And hygge really is a practice that people have in the winter time. During these really dark winters, they come together, they create cozy spaces with candles. Candlelight is big, with little cakes and pastries and coffee and maybe a campfire or things like that. And it's easy to mistake the aesthetic for the philosophy behind it, right? I love a hyggelic aesthetic. It's all over my house. And also there's a philosophy underneath it of we are pulling in together. We're pulling each other in to this cozy, comforting, shielded space, right? Shielded from the harsh winter, where we can share warmth and we can share togetherness. So hygge is a mindset as much as it is ambience. And they also have this tendency to make little celebrations all throughout the year that are just like little opportunities to come together and just have a little joy. They have different celebratory days throughout the year, like Crawfish Day, or I think there's one that is like Stuffed Donut Day or something like that, where they just have this opportunity to celebrate something, but it's really about the celebrating for the sake of celebration. They also have something called Little Saturday. I can't remember the Norwegian term. Little Saturday, which happens on Wednesday, but it's like an opportunity to just have a little bit of the weekend in the middle of the week. And that might be the day that you have a little chocolate with your lunch or have some little special treat. But there's this opportunity to celebrate and savor the little things in life. So these are the patterns that I see, all the way from the political to the personal to the communal, that really seem to go a long way toward making the Nordic people the happiest people on earth. I would love to hear what came up for you as you were listening to this. What are some ways that you would like to pull any of these ideas into your life? Are there ways that you might be thinking a little bit differently about hierarchies or about the idea of basic self-respect being a right, your time in nature, wanting to prioritize that more? I would love to hear what comes up for you in this. And I want to thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you soon. Tending the Soul is produced by Maggie Hollenbeck, all rights reserved. Music is by Dimitro Kubalin from Pixabay. Thanks, Dimitro. Episodes will drop about twice a month, so if you like what you hear, you know what to do. Follow, subscribe, review, and share. You'll find more of my work at my home on Substack. Go to maggiehollenbeck.substack.com or click the link in the show notes. You can subscribe for free or choose a paid plan to become a part of my community with monthly care packages and live gatherings. Love that you stopped by, and I hope you'll make it a habit. Bye for now.